And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection. The more we drink, the more you're protected.
Absolutely.
This week, Dan Guinn from FrancisSchaeferStudies.org joins to take part in from his dystopian life to talk about Francis Schaefer on apologetics in Dystopia. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher still is Ron Hensel, and here is Ronnie Baby.
Greetings from sunny Florida, where the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. Our regular legal disclaimer, our guest singular on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Dan Guinn, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast, hereafter known as the Webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. This satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements notice: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on someone else to ensure your continued access, please go to MidwestOutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And this webcast is Y2K compliant. And don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. And now our special guest is Dan Guinn. Yay, Dan. We have broken down, we actually almost broke our budget here to provide fake applause just for your enjoyment, instead of that fake applause where I held up my fingers and did that. So,
well, thank you guys. Yes, thanks for having me on. I'm kind of been missing you guys, so I'm glad to be back with you, and especially to talk about this subject matter of all the ones that we've been talking about. So
yeah, well, and this really is an important one, more maybe today even than 3 years ago, as culture has continued to slide into being dystopian in every imaginable way. Now, you and I spoke a couple weeks ago as we were setting this up, and one of the ways I keep my sanity, because we're dealing with heavy subjects all the time, we're dealing with cults and false teaching and writing and researching, and so when I drive around, I listen to audiobooks. I love audiobooks, and I listen to things completely disconnected from what I'm doing, usually some dystopian novel or other. I find them fascinating. And part of the reason I find them fascinating, oddly enough, is when I'm trying to sort of get away from this stuff, it all surfaces in the books. Right? All of the same issues sort of rise in the books. And you're seeing the characters kind of grappling with questions of truth and meaning and even morality in these sorts of things. So, I mean, we watched our country go from, I want to be a little careful how I say this, but plunge into thinking that burning down cities, looting and robbing, harming people and killing some is peaceful demonstration. I'm not sure.
Mostly peaceful. Mostly peaceful.
It's mostly a peaceful demonstration. I'm
Yeah.
not really sure how that works itself out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly what has gotten me writing in particular, is because you look around and you see really a world in tension. It's constantly, I mean, around us at every turn. But also another thing that I've seen, obviously, from my studies of Schaefer, is that with Schaefer, tension is a place where truth can thrive. It's a place where we can speak. And so even in the midst of utter chaos, Schaefer is convinced, wow, we just have a greater opportunity to speak and a greater opportunity for testimony. And so as we see around us a world in tension, and I want to unpack that term for Schaefer, that concept of tension is really where the reality that we're seeing, or that people are trying to live by, is not consistent with the world that God has made.
Right.
And I think that's part of it.
You've done a paper on this, and to kind of give us some sense of direction, I thought I'd at least bring up your sections, and then
Great, thank you for that.
That's kind of where you're at right now. Tensions with truth and humanity. Now, I'm a Schaefer fan. Ron's a Schaefer fan.
Yeah,
you're more of a Schaefer expert. So,
well, I'm still learning from all the other experts, but at Labrie, and so and also guys like Mark Ryan at Covenant Seminary, who's over the Francis Schaeffer Institute. So I love interacting with these guys and learning from them. And but as I analyze Schaefer on this point, in respect to the tension, and then also compare that with what's going on when you read books like Huxley. You can read. You're reading Brave New World, or you're reading Orwell's 1984. What you see is that there's a bit of a system that begins to sort of arise out of that in order to gain a premise of authoritarianism. And one of the key things, looking at that and reading those side by side, and also coming at them from a Schaefer perspective, you immediately see the compromise and loss of truth. And it's the same thing that Schaefer talks about in How Should We Then Live video series, when he's talking about Rome. This ever marching premise that is constantly coming forth, and it breeds greater and greater authoritarianism. And so that's one of the things that immediately you're struck with, but then also the fact that truth is eroded in order to do that. You have to take truth apart and dismantle it, and basically redefine truth for the people that are there in the dystopia. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
Yeah, and is it always the case of dismantling it, or sometimes is it a case of distracting from it?
Yeah, because I think in a certain sense, you're right there. I mean, you can't ultimately really dismantle it, but you have to reconstruct it in their thinking. I mean, you have, of course, two different interesting positions. Like you have like the Orwellian position, obviously, where you're really getting at more of an absolute kind of authoritarian control type thing. Whereas with Huxley's Brave New World, you're getting a specific where they're kind of lost in this kind of sort of euphoria, being distracted from it by, right, the use of soma, which is, kind of like a drug. And I think we're a little bit like that right now. I mean, we are dealing with elements of that, but I think it's also, there's a variable there that's different in our dystopia of where we are right now, in the sense that it's more in line with what Marshall McLuhan was talking about in his studies, specifically that the media is the message. And he spells on his book, by an accidental printing error, massage. So medium is the massage, and they decided, yeah, that's perfect, just keep it that way.
Keep it that way, yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, you think about that a minute. You know, the medium is the massage. We're so massaged by entertainment. We're massaged by the manipulation of the various political spheres, and right and left, sometimes even going against each other in that. And so, yeah, it's the war is on, if you will, with respect to the war on the base worldview of the God who is there.
So at what point are we in a dystopian world? How do we say, here we are, it's dystopia, welcome to dystopia?
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with that too a little bit, Ron. I mean, you, in a certain sense, you could look back and you could go, okay, as early as the 60s, we're seeing movements in that. And some of the things, of course, that Schaefer was talking about then are more true now than they were when he was talking about them.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the things, especially the movements in transhumanism and the manipulation of biology. Right. And Schaefer, of course, was using terms like the biological bomb and some of that. And we were kind of like, oh, you know, is he being alarmist? You know, we couldn't quite connect. But now I think we can see that. We can see some of that stuff. The questions, too, about even with the nature of disease and, you know, the usage of things to control viruses. I mean, some of the experimentation on viruses, for example, they sugarcoat with respect to those terms that they're using. I think of the one they're using a term with respect to the manipulation of a virus that is basically altering its effectiveness, and then but they use it in a very soft way to make it more palatable, and yet don't. What kind of worldview would justify the transmuting of a virus to make it more violent and make it more of an attack on the human person? I think that's the second point. Beyond the loss of truth, I think you start getting into the loss of humanity. And I think when you cross that human threshold, to me, that's kind of your big indicator. I mean, you're going to always see truth being compromised, but the loss of humanity, I think, for me, is kind of like that. That's the big marker. Is it becomes more and more prominent. The human essence is being subdued.
Well, I mean, when most people think of dystopia, they think of, you know, all of the structures that keep life livable or bearable have fallen apart, basically. So, you know, Don and others have made the statement. I think, Don, you've kind of quoted the statement, and I've actually tried to track this down, because I remember one of my Wheaton professors used to say it. I said it more than once, that the 20. This is, of course, we're still in the 20th century when I was in this class. The 20th century is more like the first century than any century since. Well, you know, when people lived in the first century, they really didn't think they were living in a dystopia. Right. Now, when we look back on it, it looks kind of dystopian compared to what we had. But one of the things that, beginning in 27 BC, you had something called the Pax Romana, lasted until, you know, early second century. No civil wars majorly, you know, disrupting this huge area, which estimates have it that we're talking between 60 and 70 million people, which, again, another estimate is that was about a third of the people that lived on Earth lived in the Roman Empire. And so things were fine from their point of view. You send us back there and we'd scream, you know, it's like, there's no freedom of speech. There's, you know, little freedom of religion at all, and other things we take for granted. On the other hand, there was relative prosperity. Things were holding together. So when does that change? The real dystopia for Europeans begins with the barbarian invasions in Western Europe. And there are some people who argue with you over whether there ever really was a dark age. There wasn't, in the sense of like absolutely all learning being lost, but things were pretty dark around the year AD 600. If you're in the Western, it didn't necessarily last through the whole Middle Ages, but things were pretty dark. Things were pretty dystopian.
Right.
In fact, the city of London, for a while, I mean, it was founded by the Romans, and for I don't know how long, a couple of centuries, it was totally depopulated. Nobody was living there. It was a ghost town. So, you had certain things that were dystopian. What does it take to get to that? I mean, that's what people are really worried about. Frankly, most people aren't worried if they're going to get food, clothing, shelter, and extra spending money on the side.
Well, I guess part of it for me is that I mean, to your point, I definitely agree. I think we can look back on history and we see some times that might qualify for sure in the dystopian light. But I think in what I'm seeing here with respect to this concept is that some of the themes are almost that the people are living in the dystopia and they don't even realize that they are. I mean, that's one of the things with Brave New World and 1984 is that both sides become, whichever people become sort of oblivious to the fact that, to they're there. I mean, and I got a little bit ahead of myself, but one of the quotes really from the controller, I think from Brave New World says, our Ford himself did a great deal to shift the emphasis from truth to beauty, to comfort from and happiness. Mass production demanded the shift. Universal happiness keeps the wheels steadily turning. Truth and beauty can't. I mean, you start seeing things where it's sort of like, let's kind of wipe the wipe the positive away and then just kind of replace it with a deception. And then the other thing that both of the stories begin to speak to, and here's another one from this one's from the O'Brien character in 1984. It says, "We control matter because we control the mind. Reality is inside the skull." So, I mean, you start to have this means of really kind of mass control to some controllers' ultimate end.
You're living in the matrix, right?
Yeah.
Well, in a sense, now, and I don't want to delve into politics too much, but I think I want to use this example to maybe help people understand what I think is going on, at least with this dystopian situation. Is Norm Geisler said years ago, as he and I were talking about this, and I carried this with me, and I think it's true. I think it's very true. Is in elections, you have about 20% of our population hard left ideologues. You have about 20% that are hard right ideologues. And then you have the other 60% somewhere along the line between those two. Now, that 60% is an interesting group because they're not highly committed to an ideology other than they want to live a relatively trouble-free life at home if they can, have good relations with their neighbors, work there 50 or so weeks a year, take a vacation, get the kids through college. They don't want to take hard positions. They don't want to fight with their neighbor. They just mostly want to be left alone. Now, here's what happens to them. When elections come, you have the scare tactics. And what they don't do is they don't sign on to vote for something. They shy away from radicalism, whatever the radicalism appears to be. So if you can paint your candidate as far more radical than our candidate, you're going to win because they're going to shift away from the radicalism. Now, here's how this plays out, in my opinion, on what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I think the statistics are probably very close to that just in general living. So if you can keep a population somewhat afraid of the boogeyman that you have created, they will live in dystopia as long as they feel like they're protected and can be happy.
Mm-hmm.
And don't we see both political parties, not straying into politics, but we see both sides doing it.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
We definitely do. And I think that speaks to also Schaeffer's concept of personal peace and affluence. That he covered in How Should We Then Live? I mean, we want to be well off. We want to be undisturbed. We want to make sure that our life is, comfortable, and we just would rather not have to deal with that. And so I think a lot of people get frustrated by the constant movement in that way. It's like, I just want to, go to work and make the money and set my family up, for the future and, take care of things. And yet we have this constant kind of upper battle going on in the middle of it. And it's just only, I don't know about you guys, but I felt it just only increase in my lifetime. I don't know how it's.
Yeah, you might say that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's. I think we would say the same. I would say the same thing. What about you, Don?
I would, and I have my question maybe goes to the state of the church in all of this. Before we go on to your point 4. And that is this. If I think most of the church doesn't understand that we live in dystopian times. I mean, they see trouble out there, but then we have, like, on one side, we have progressives that are going, well, it's just a problem because of you conservatives. You're creating this problem. And so we're the boogeyman now. That everyone else needs to be protected from, because we actually believe, like, there's a truth that we should know and that impacts our life.
It's frightening to consider that there might be a truth.
Yeah, exactly. It's scary.
Yeah, I find this it's kind of a surreal thing. I mean, if you're debating people online, like I was debating an atheist online even last week, and he just because he saw the word God on my profile, it was automatically, okay, well, we'll start picking apart. And so he it sort of like had an atheist checklist of all the things that he could target, who was Cain's wife, and just all kinds of stuff he kept and he's trying to get at the you might as well ask what Jesus' favorite color was. I mean, he was just he had all his nice little boxes to check, and when I answered him appropriately, he leveled that, well, you're all about doing these verbal gymnastics. And I said, it is, what I'm giving you is an educated response. Right. And he's like, well, there's no response for that. It's just, there's no justification. And I think that's also one way that we need to make sure that we're solid with respect to moral and ethics is the basis of them. We believe we have truth, and because we have truth, we have a moral base, moral ethics, and therefore we have to stand firm on things like inerrancy, and we have to stand true to that, and at the same time also understand the basis of biblical law. I could not have unpacked or even began to reply to this guy if I didn't understand the moral, civil, and ceremonial aspects of the law and how the Old Testament's constructed, and the Mosaic principles, and that versus, the moral, ethical precepts that we live by under the law of Christ.
Right.
He was oblivious to that. And
it's amazing how many questions really are resolved just by reading the Bible,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. But it's a hard thing. And I think a lot of times the average Christian maybe is kind of short of handling those things because they don't know how to go there. But I think the other thing that we can do when you don't know what to say, ask questions back to get at the point.
Jesus did that, and I go, that's kind of my style. I love it when they would come with what they're thinking is a conundrum he cannot get out of, and then he just sort of asks a different question, and the whole thing crumbles.
Yeah, because sometimes you can lead them to that place. And I think, what we have to realize too is that something that Schaefer said, which I think he says, modern man has no moral imperative for what he should do, and consequently he is left only with what he can do. And he is doing what he can do, even though he stands in terror. And the biggest terror of all is who is going to shape the human race. So, I mean, if you think about that, I mean, it's everything is on the table for them because there's no restrictions. Right. And I think that asking the questions like I do this a lot. I say, I know why I as a Christian have this belief because I have a moral base based in scripture. But how do you, as from the atheist perspective or this other perspective, how do you form a basis for saying such and such is wrong? Because they really don't.
They don't. And we were talking about this just before we came on, is the new theme. And we ran into this, I was mentioning at the Parliament of the World's Religions. One of the main themes going through almost through every person we spoke with there is their inner knowingness tells them what's true. And so I used this story with several as I would start a conversation trying to figure out exactly what they believe. And some years back, I had taken a group through a Hindu temple. They understand, okay, here's what they're doing, here's what they believe, and let them explain it for themselves. And the tour guide, he stopped at each station and he would talk about the different incarnations of Vishnu. And when we got to the end of it, one of our team and some other people had joined up the tour who were considering becoming Hindus also. So this was interesting. Had raised a question, is Jesus an incarnation of Vishnu? And he said, oh, yes. And so I have a question. Would one incarnation of Vishnu lie about all the other incarnations of Vishnu? And he said, oh, it's not possible. And then I said, well, Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except by him. There is no other way. Therefore, all the other incarnations are false. And he stood there momentarily. He turned red and he said, Jesus lied, and he turned and walked away. So as I would relay that story at the Parliament, I was, for example, I was speaking with a New Thought guy, and I told the story, and he said, oh, Jesus never said that. And I go, oh, okay. So how would you know that he never said that? He said, well, my inner knowingness tells me he wouldn't say anything like that. I said, oh, okay, your inner knowingness. Well, let me ask you something about inner knowingness. If my inner knowingness tells me that rape is a good thing, he said, oh, your inner knowingness would ever tell you that. I go, well, how do you know that? It's my inner knowingness. It's not your inner knowingness. And in fact, we have a book, The Natural History of Rape, written by two evolutionists who argue that that was part of the evolutionary process whereby the less desirable males forced females to succumb to them. They impregnated them, and that's how their gene pool was carried on. And so clearly their inner knowingness directed them to do that. And he was stuck, which then got us into a discussion on, is there an absolute truth and where can we discover that? But you have to get to that point.
Yeah, it's so important. And I think especially too when you're dealing with people that are living in the abstract. I think for a long time that Christianity has kind of gone through those places where our constant response was to quote back scripture. And not that that's wrong, it's just that it's not situational. We're not being responsible with the sword because there's times when we actually have to make sure that the scripture is understood. So right. Schaeffer's, you notice that Schaeffer doesn't just purely quote scriptures to rebut these arguments, but he frames it in a certain way that's in the cultural context that they can understand. And you have to also begin to to question and take apart those premises that are in front of you before sometimes you can speak, because they have a natural, they've built up a barrier. As Schaefer says, he's got that roof over their head. And let me make a quick correction, so I make sure that I make this statement. So, and by the way, I was bumped by Greg Kokel for your last meeting, and of course I'm happy to take the lesser place. But I also wanted to make a comment too. Last interview, I mentioned that I think Schaefer's his borrowing of Schaefer's "Take the Roof Off" was important, but I didn't want to disparage what he's doing, because Schaefer has really kind of a tension against the issue of being mechanical in our apologetic. But but I also want to say that Schaefer would more than likely praise Kokel because of the fact that we aren't teaching apologetic and not learning any systematic approaches to defending the faith. Anyway, side note there. But again, back to this truth matter. I mean, we've got to begin to kind of defuse some of these things before we can speak. We've got to kind of use the questions to defuse the matters in front of us, so that we can interject truth into those concepts.
Well, and you're talking about questions, and I really like questions. And one of the questions that we have, it comes from one of our sponsors.
Yeah, they have in fact, they have a few questions. Have traditional family dinners become unbearably tedious? Do you wonder when someone will invent a board game that distracts others from your privilege? Do you want to be part of something bigger than yourself while remaining the center of your universe? Then we have just what you're looking for. Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. In Where's the Outrage, there are no unfair, inequality-promoting dice. The rules for taking turns are simple. Each player gets points for being in an oppressed group. And then turns are taken in the order of the most points. Next, you choose a bankroller, also known as the game's George Soros. The George Soros distributes the game cards, and now you're ready to play. Each player chooses a game piece and places it in the forward space. In this case, the one with the most points is Briannold, an African-American, Native American, non-binary, transgendered, former female. Pronouns are Marx, Engels, and Lenin. And now Briannold can move wherever Briannold would like to move, and Briannold chooses to move to a Christian-owned bakery where Briannold takes a free lawyer's card and occupies the space. And now Briannold is free to move anywhere Briannold wants to. And now they go down to this free speech zone where they just blow off those fascist white supremacists and their stupid free speech with an entitlements card. And the fun of being the center of your universe is just beginning. Get real purpose back in your life while taking it away from others with Where's the Outrage? The game where the woke shall inherit the earth, unless, of course, they're white males. And I just can't say enough about this game. But enough about that game. So let's get back to what we were talking about.
Yeah, where can I buy that one?
Oh, you can buy it any place where MSNBC or CNN are broadcasting. Or the governor of California is speaking. Yeah, the Roman Centurion wants. I think you can pretty much find it anywhere in most urban places.
Ron, here's another one. Roman Centurion says, "Where can I order?"
I saw that.
That's right. Yeah. We need a link.
Yeah.
We'll have to come out with our own. We'll have to get a publishing company and make sure.
Oh yeah, the Real McCoy, MCOI.
Yeah, make sure everybody has one.
Well, and sometimes we have to remind people these are satire, because I've actually had some of our guests who've seen this email me go, "I'm looking for that game. I need that."
Well, we'll do our best.
So, and that's going to bring us to, here we go. I got to bring our little slideshow back up again. Because I think this section here has some additional points that I want to talk about. Okay. And let me just go down one. There we go.
There you
Section
go.
4,
Yeah.
facing the dystopian implications. Now, I would like to kind of go through these briefly. I'd like you to do that, Dan.
Sure.
And because what we've been doing so far is laying out, okay, here's the issue. Here's what's happening in our culture. It is dystopian. It's varying degrees of that. But it is dystopian largely because we've kind of left as a nation the Judeo-Christian faith, but are trying to sort of hold on to the Judeo-Christian morality, not attached to the faith. And I don't think that works well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, well, I did want to, I'll reply too in the context of this that James Lopez out there mentioned. Most folks have a live and let live concept. And I think, we sometimes will live and let live and ignore all the manipulation around us and maybe even ignore each other's concerns because, oh, that's you. Because in the advent of personal truth, you've got your truth, I've got mine, we're good. And let's not worry about it. But then social media has sort of aggravated that because people post their truth and then other people will say that's wrong. And so we're living in that world of contradiction. I think that our challenge is really to learn how to speak in such a way to kind of lead people to those conclusions that, that can't live relativistically in a social media construct. And I can't live in a world claiming freedom when I'm undergoing manipulation. And so I think the big one right there, you mentioned scientific manipulation.
Right.
I think like I mentioned that term was called gain of function.
Gain of function, right.
Function. What does gain of function mean? I mean, it's so abstracted from the reality that we are making this virus more potent. And should call attention to really what's going on. We are using or learning to use soft words, as Schaefer called it. We are seeing these soft words be put out that are allowing people to kind of code it in a nice way so that everybody can think it's okay, and yet it's some of the things are lethal. And so I see scientific manipulation in the area of some of the current biological developments, the movements toward transhumanism, basically thinking that we can manipulate the human body in such a way to kind of reconstruct it and fix its ills. And yet in some ways that's sort of backfiring because we're ending up with deformity. Maybe we're not full on transhumanism in the scope that we see in some of these dystopian novels, but it is definitely marching forward because there's a lot of specific manipulation of individual care that are being adopted. And so if you read some of this stuff, you're really surprised. I mean, back in Schaefer's day in the 60s, they were talking about, putting LSD in the water source.
Right.
We're in that mode of concept here, but in a more subtle way. No, we can put it in the medical system and we can put it in and we can control your carbon footprint and et cetera, so I'm very concerned about some of the eco-friendly aspects of that and how it emphasizes dehumanism. And that's my concern with some of that. And at least one of the big ways I see was scientific manipulation.
Yeah. And well, you can do the same thing with climate change, but at the Parliament, it was, in fact, we wrote an article on this a few weeks back. Richard Rohr was at the Parliament. Was fascinating to talk with them briefly, and then they had a panel discussion about psychotropic drugs and the benefits of them for culture, not only for health and healing, but in his words, it should be included as a sacrament of the church. Psilocybin should be included as a sacrament of the church. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So we have baptism, we have communion, and we have, the drug thing, so you can really enjoy the sermon and get in touch with God.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the key thing that everybody should key in on when they hear stuff like that is there's some sort of form of escapism. or escape reality. I mean, we as Christians aren't mystical. I want to be clear on that, because how Schaefer explains this is we're not mystical by nature. There is a mystical aspect to our faith, as far as who God is and spirituality, but we're not mystical. That means we don't have to contrive these things. One of my favorite quotes from Schaefer is like, he says, we don't need to be in a dark room. We don't need to be under the influence of a hallucinatory drug. We don't need to be uncertain. The doors is open now, the intellectual doors, but also the doors of reality are open before us. And what he's talking about is true spirituality in the Christian faith. I don't have to manipulate it. I don't have to sit someplace and get high. I don't have to do none of that. All I have to do is commune with the Father through the Holy Spirit and prayer, and focus really on consuming His Word. I mean, if anything should get us excited about the Christian faith, is the fact that truth does apply to us, and it does answer the questions, and it does pertain to us in such a real way.
You know, you were talking earlier about people using soft words to describe things that really are kind of horrible. That trend, I don't know exactly when it started, but I can tell you that at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a trend in sociology to look at all cultures as from a neutral perspective. And this kind of went hand in hand with the efforts to see sociology considered one of the sciences on a par with, physics and chemistry and things like that. So, how can we claim to be neutral if we think our own society is superior to the ones we're studying? And so that was the idea. And by the middle, or maybe even before the middle of the 20th century, this had pretty much achieved the victory in sociology, so that, whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, it was considered kind of offensive to think of, pygmies in South America, or, people in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa as pretty much equal to people in the Western world. By the middle of the 20th century, it was not offensive to look at them that way. And by the end of the 20th century, it's now offensive to think of one culture as superior to another. And it's almost as though, in some cases, those cultures, well, you already had the noble savage idea that Schaefer talks about in some of his books. The idea that there's something actually superior about what we would consider a more primitive culture. And that idea was already there, and it hasn't gone away. If anything, it's become stronger.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting, that movement too in the area of science, especially, is there's a certain equation that we're working from there, which is in pertinence to physics, but then also humanness, the aspect of remaking that, or being in better touch with our animal selves, and then correcting those errors that animals have, and so by that, all the doors are open, because I can fix me, and it's just like we do with other animals. We breed cattle, but we can manipulate that, and I mean it gives you some pause if you've read anything like Huxley, where you've got that biological manipulation that is going to be kind of class based, where they're breeding and doing various things specifically to bring about the ultimate persona for a given work place person that they would fill. I mean, so yeah, it's huge. It's just, I think it touches every area of who we are.
Well, the soft language issue is interesting, and I'm glad you raised that. We have seen that happening in many of the issues within our nation. At one time, years ago, the discussion was between pro-life and pro-abortion. Pro-abortion equals death. And so they landed on soft words. Oh, it's pro-choice. It's a woman.
Well, that's almost a positive spin on it.
Right. That's
really.
exactly. It's a positive spin on a bad act. But as Ron was talking, I recalled and we did an article on this some time ago, quote that he drew from the Old Testament, which is the same thing where the people say, speak to us smooth words.
Right.
It's a human condition. This is not new to our century, but it's just more prevalent, it seems.
Yeah, and I think too, also you see that. I mean, obviously, at the highest level in the manipulation of law, because we'll use even soft words or use hard words directed at the wrong things to bring about that manipulation. And then also too, I think of this manipulation of history. You know, if you read certain aspects of some of the dystopian tales, you know, they'll rewrite history in certain scopes because you know, one of the quotes is that reality is inside the skull. You know, and then basically that they're going to give you what your reality ought to be. So
well,
if I
can save the world, right?
I believe so. Yeah, and so this concept of manipulation and those ways using the current means of speech and the current means of proclaiming things such as social media and video and everything, they've just as Schaefer said, this coming generation will have more means of manipulation than any other generation before it. And what's funny to me is when he was talking about that, he was talking at length forever about transistors. If you listen to some of his lectures on this subject, so he was so far ahead of it. But I think he would be amazed at how far we've come with this.
Yeah, the book, The Church at the End of the 20th Century, I think it is.
Yes, absolutely.
It's almost like prophetic in nature. Because he sort of gives you, if we go this way, here's what I think will happen. If we go this way, here's what I think is going to happen. And he was like right on target almost all the way down with it.
Yeah, I see him regularly having his thumb on the pulse, partly because of his discussions were so deep and thorough with people that were unbelievers who were dealing with these things. And obviously in his thinking, you know, he had been equipped in such a way in some of his training to begin to spot these issues and tensions, but then it went to another level with him because not only could he see the tension, but he also would understand their thinking and what was going on behind their thinking, and also see where it was going. And so it's very easy to point downstream now. We can see, oh, look where we're at right now. If you continue to take this and follow it, you're going to be there, and it should not surprise them because we're already at this place.
Right. So, manipulation of theater and art. What form does that take?
Yeah, that's definitely a Schaefer thing for sure, because I'm pulling that from him. Specifically, Schaefer would see that a lot of these films that were coming out were, painting these pictures and they were manipulating culture, and some of those were so carefully elaborate because they were using, in his time, they were using a lot of unconventional art. So you had specifically where you'd have these art shows where you could go to them and basically you would walk in and it was a full-on experience. But if you have ever watched some of this video, you would see that it was just kind of like reined in chaos and this and that. Likewise, you have other ones. Some of the ones that you should go check out in particular is go watch Cage's where Cage is on this show, John Cage, and he is doing a demonstration of his kind of musical art form, and he's walking around a stage doing all these various things, and it's like it's all random and noise and all this and that, and it's just kind of reined in chaos, and everybody's kind of chuckling, and that's very humorous. But at the time, in this black and white, they were like, "Aha, that's funny," this guy's. But he was very serious. They thought he was, while he thought he was humorous, he was very serious. And what's rather fascinating, if you watch that at the beginning of it, what does he do? He pulls out a stopwatch and sets a timer, and he does all those things on key. So here he's saying the universe is random, yet he's using a stopwatch to say that. It's the manipulation of the concepts that continue to be pushed forward by saying that the universe is random and that there is no order, and yet they use order to say that. It's kind of like sitting on God's lap and slapping him in the face. You've got this regular principle that they'll use that you can see in their manipulation to kind of get you to go along mindlessly, to just enjoy the spectacle rather than take in what they're really saying, which is sinister.
Right. And they also, through, now this is not theater, but I think it is in the area of art, film, major film especially, that are transforming worldviews of people that brings us to today. So you have The Matrix. I love The Matrix. I took myself to see The Matrix as soon as it opened. It was a great way to explain Eastern mysticism, for example, to a young lad, because that's what they were conveying. However, most who are sitting in the theater taking this in, yes, they're being entertained, but they're being taught a different worldview at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I personally too really loved The Matrix, but I also loved that the message was kind of sort of in their face, and yet they were kind of, I mean, so when you talk about dystopia, for sure, The Matrix eventually comes up because of the absolute abstraction from reality and the dehumanization that has to transpire. These people are living in these pods and being, fed mechanisms to keep them alive and entertaining their brains so that they can still be of substance and use, all to to handle the great machine and feed it, and they're the energy source. And isn't that interesting? I mean, it's painted so well, but I think in some ways it very much connects to who or what we're dealing with right now. I think that the other part of it, though, is that there was a mystical aspect that people maybe weren't picking up on from that Eastern mystic type approaches and how it was told. But again, you're always kind of balancing this, because every thing that gets told ends up being, consuming something. They're always bringing their own presuppositions to the table. And I think it's important to have a filter. So I watched that with my kids. I'm like, okay, be prepared. This is going to be coming from this perspective, but here's where you can see that there are some valuable things in it. And I think that's especially people like Nancy Pearcey in particular, that really kind of raises the bar on that, is making sure that we are forming a right filter, because you can't protect yourself from everything, and in some ways you probably shouldn't. Schaefer read and watched things that probably a lot of Christians would never watch in his generation, but he watched it with the right filter, and it made him a better apologist. And so
he's informed about where culture is going.
Mm-hmm.
So even things like, back to The Matrix, that one scene that just sticks in my mind every time I talk about this is when Keanu is racing through, and he comes to a young, basically a Buddhist boy who's bending a spoon. And he asks, well, how do you do that? And he looks at him and goes, there is no spoon. So what's he saying about reality? There is no reality.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's no.
They were in the Matrix, though, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
But
The
even
Matrix
that
was
is,
supposed to be the Matrix was supposed to be what
Illusion.
and it's also supposed to be perhaps our reality. How do we know?
Right. That's correct.
Yeah.
yeah, and I think that's, I mean, it's interesting that particular paradigm paints this realm of skepticism, and yet even if that is the reality, then the spoon has to have some substance, even if it's digital.
But
It's
in the third Matrix, doesn't Neo get the powers that he had in the Matrix in the real world?
yeah,
Maybe not all of
interesting.
them. Yeah, but he gets them, and so that, which implies that even this real world is maybe a matrix for something else.
A matrix within a matrix. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this I once went to a presentation of a guy who did he was a student of astrophysics and various forms of science with respect to things, and was doing his full presentation on the concept that our reality could be a potential abstraction, if you will, or basically a created into reality essence that is being generated from another source, which I thought was really kind of fascinating to come at that point from science. And he's like, now it's not provable, but this is where the theory lies, and you're getting into crazy theoretical side of things, but I think at the same time we know that our reality in some ways is a bit of an abstraction from the true reality that is the spirituality of that we that God and the ultimate reality of God himself, and I don't know that we should ever view it all like that. We have to always be cautious when we're doing these sort of skeptical things, but we can at least see some interesting aspects of that.
So we're kind of getting near the end, and we've talked about the issues of how we get to a dystopian world, how it operates, which is, as you pointed out right in the beginning, authoritarian. It has to be authoritarian by nature in order to continue this sort of thing. We saw it in 1984, and we're seeing it really in the area of how not just the United States, but other nations are being run, where you have this hard authoritarianism, no dissent allowed. You will be canceled if you happen to have a different idea. Sometimes Joy and I talk about it. We kind of yearn for the days of actual liberals where we didn't agree, but we would fight for each other's right to be wrong, as it were. Right? We could have heated exchanges and still enjoy dinner together or something. You can't do that today as much. But how does that impact the church? In a few minutes, how should church leadership think about these things and train their people? It is my contention, and Ron and I have talked about this a lot, that the role of the church is twofold. The ministry of the church is training, equipping, guarding the flock, discipling believers. That's the task of the church and its normal meetings. The mission of the church is taking those trained, equipped people and sending them out into a dystopian culture to share the gospel. Now, if that's true, and I would argue it is, how does this impact that for leadership?
Yeah, I mean, we have to be mindful of the situation we're in order to make sure we're doing that rightly. I think that obviously the preeminence of the word, having it being the absolute focus of our personal and corporate worship experience is paramount, because if we establish truth, when we know what truth is and we go out into culture, then we can see the tensions of culture. I think the worst thing that we've gotten into is sometimes we'll teach soft topical messages or messages that are disconnected from the biblical sources and reality itself in some ways, and you're not getting at really the hard concepts. I think that naturally, when you look at Scripture with true honesty, you begin to see things that are quite wonderful in the experience of trying to address culture. I mean, even going through something like we're going through Genesis in my church, going through the story of the patriarchs, and you see all this the different dynamics and everything that's going on, and you see the sinfulness of these people, and yet God's constant preservation for them. I think that that's so important. But then likewise, I think for the church needs to learn how to counsel and how to speak as far as the defense of the faith. So our first point obviously is to stay true to truth, but our second point is to begin to speak to our culture around it and help each other with understanding how to speak to these things, even what questions to ask of them, and knowing, because I think once you have a certain amount of ammunition, if you will, in this case, then you have the means to and the ability to begin to speak to it, and then that tension can interact with the truth that you bring.
You know, I'm going to go to a B movie that I sort of like, Roddy Piper's film, They Live. And, you know, everyone's just kind of going through life, cruising through life, doesn't, you know, hit the bumps, whatever. And he comes across these glasses that enable him to actually see what's going on. And he has sort of these aliens living on the planet that are persuading you through, I forget exactly the word, but, you know, they have signs that you can't just read normally that look like pictures, but when you have the glasses on, you see it says consume. It says all these other things on how to behave. So subtle, what's the psychological word?
Subliminal?
Subliminal, yes. Subliminal messages being conveyed to the population of humans in order to allow these beings to take over the country and the world. I kind of see this in that light, in a sense, because we become, as James said, live and let live concept. We don't really see the dangers around us. And the Word of God puts on those glasses so you can see culture as it really is.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and you can't really emphasize that enough, because I think if you, I mean, Schaefer always talked about presuppositions. If you have the wrong presuppositions, you can't address reality properly. And so one of the things that happens with people who have false presuppositions is that they sort of begin to construct their own view of reality,
Right.
and also even try to protect themselves in their intellectual thinking from the real reality that is, because if the real reality hit them, it would just come crushing down on their head. Right. And so we have to be gentle when we are conveying this with them, so that, and even take blows ourselves. We need to be a little bit thick-skinned in these touching of or in these specific conversations we're having with people, because man, it's not a soft world now with the social media. People are quite because they're behind the thing and abstracted with the electronical. They can be as full of vitriol as they want to be. So that's the other dynamic that's a little bit different. In person, they might be as kind as could be, but on social media,
yeah. You're behind a screen, so you can be as cruel as you want to be in your argumentation. So that's good. Now next week, by the way, we're going to be sort of continuing this kind of a discussion, because we talk about the impact of the climate change activist and how that's really affecting the world in general. Those who are in poverty, for example, how does this work itself out? So These are big issues because they use the soft language or the scary language of the planet is going to burn up and we're all going to die if we don't do whatever.
They say that like it's a bad thing too. You know?
Yeah, I know where I'm going to be if I don't. So.
Yes.
Such a bad trip. Ron, would you care to, by the way, all your information is in the bottom. That his talk is actually down there on the link. You can get that in his book. Dan, thanks for being with us again. Ron?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and The Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygamous. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Loosey Goosey. Transgender issues coverage comes from Ben-Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yolig Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law. Not even once.
All righty.
Yeah. People are so smart they haven't even tried, you know.